mentioned.
Oh. 1 second, sorry.
Welcome to panel 18B on transdisciplinary science insights for understanding managed retreat across hazards, scales, and geographies. My name is Sirkku, Juhola, and I'm from the University of Helsinki in Finland. And I'm here with my colleague Reinhard Mechler from International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis from Vienna, Austria. And we are sharing an exciting panel looking at several different disciplines from geography, environmental and climate sciences, economics, risk science, mathematics, finance and insurance, political science and governance. And we're bringing all these disciplines together and sharing insights from experts, advisors, from international NGOs and international institutions to discuss managed retreat. Our examples are global, and Reinhard will tell you a little bit more about those.
Yeah, welcome. Warm welcome from Vienna, and great to be in this conference at the last day. So yeah, indeed, we have a great set of colleagues joining us to present. I hope we can also engage with you in the audience and see about a good discussion to be had at day 3 of this conference. Yeah, many sessions have been done. I think what's a bit unique, a bit different from others is we're presenting coastal and non-coastal retreat issues. We try to also identify cross-cutting issues and implications with participants for policy and practice. I think a common denominator somehow that combines us a little bit, this question about transformation. A sort of talk about transformation remains a bit elusive, but is retreat not this? Forced retreat, a voluntary retreat, is this part of transformation? IPCC has identified it, but there's little evidence, and that's what we are trying to tease out in that session. Before starting, I should say, the session is also organized for the RISC-CAN of Future Earth, and also we are collaborating with the Flood Resilience Alliance. We have a few partners present here, but then we also got other partners on board. And yeah, look forward to a great discussion in a quite busy session. And yeah, over to Sirkku again. Thanks.
Thank you. Our session is structured in the following way. We have first 35 minutes of presentations, case insights. After that, we talk, we have 3 more presentations looking at some cross-cutting issues. After that, we have a plenary discussion where all of us participate. Our first speaker comes from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, the head of program, Ina Desai. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Sirkku, and thank you, Reinhard. When I start sharing my screen, I'll just want to say, why and what I'll be talking about and what I've been asked to talk about, and why we're actually looking at managed retreat and what science can do in terms of policy making and planning on managed retreat. It's really something that we've also put forward in an article that sorry, I just want to try and share my screen. I don't think you see the full slide, right? In a proper way. Apologies for the delayed start. Okay, this should be better. So this is something that we put forward also jointly with a number of partners in an article that was published last week in Science, and that looks at what risk science and recent developments in risk science can bring to the topic of managed retreat and to the topic of displacement in the context of climate change. And why we're looking at this really is because of the scale of the problem, first and foremost, and because it has been changing over time. And this is just the blue bubbles here that you see on the screen are displacements in the context of forced movements of people in the context of disasters. And we recorded for last year alone more than 30 million of these types of movements related to extreme weather events, most of which at least can potentially be also impacted and shaped by climate change. So the scale is global, it's a global phenomenon, but also with hotspots, as we will see. And there's a cost associated to this phenomenon. And there's a direct economic impact. There are also broader downstream impacts, but the direct costs alone have been estimated in the context of conflict for more than $20 billion for 2020 alone. And this just shows the scale of what this means also potentially for the cost of disaster displacement. So there are huge data gaps right now when it comes to understanding how many people live in displacement at any given point in time in the context of disasters, in the context of climate change. But we've estimated at the end of 2020 that around 7 million people were displaced and living in displacement. So this is different to the movements that I mentioned earlier at the end of 2020. And this is a huge underestimate, we believe. And the costs associated, therefore, as you can see here, associated with livelihoods and loss of livelihoods, health, education, housing, security, etc., are borne by IDPs, the internally displaced people themselves, but also by host communities. And very often, they're not really accounted for anywhere, and they're on no one's balance sheet. An example also that might be of interest, if we look at it as a global phenomenon, is that this is really not just an issue for low-income countries, but also for high-income countries. We have an example of Australia, for example, and the bushfires there, where just costs associated with housing alone accounted for around 44 to 52 million dollars for 1 year only. So, but the past is clearly, as we know, not a good guide, as well as the present, for the future. And a lot of the risk of displacement in the future is going to shift. And this is something that we also presented in the Science article. It's small island states that are particularly affected when we look at disaster displacement risk in relation to population size. And we also see that a large number of low-income and lower middle-income countries are disproportionately affected. And we also looked at, in partnership with the Potsdam Climate Institute and the ETH Zurich, at the role of climate change in shaping displacement risk in the future. And from the research that we've done with these two institutions, we do see that with each degree of temperature increase, there's a 50%, likely 50% increase of displacement risk. So climate change does potentially play a very significant role, but so do, and even more so potentially, other factors such as, of course, demographic growth, but also changes in socioeconomic conditions and therefore vulnerabilities. So there are huge implications here for policy, and this is where we would want to put forward that risk science really has a huge role to play for more effective policy and planning, both for response, but also for long-term planning. We looked at, and this is where our colleagues from IIASA come in, from Reinhard and Stefan will talk about this, I believe, a bit more, at what this means in terms of that these economic costs put together with the risk information mean in terms of the ability of countries to absorb not just disaster shocks and losses, but also those associated with the displacement in these settings. So I won't go into too much detail, but just one example of Bangladesh. The CATSA model that IIASA has developed found that and estimates that Bangladesh would face a severe resource financing gap for disaster events that are likely to occur every 10 years. So as I said, this is these are direct implications that risk science can bring to policymaking, planning, and we look forward to discussing what other types of gaps there still exist that we need to bring into these types of approaches. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fina. That was very interesting. Our next speaker comes from the University of Zurich, Professor Christian Hackel, who's a professor of glaciology and geomorphodynamics, will be talking about retreat in the mountains.
Thanks, Sirkku. Just a second to be able to share. So I just want to share very briefly a few experiences from South America, specifically from Peru, but also linking back to some analysis we did for mountain regions more globally, and how this links into retreat. And I'm also using here the word relocation. Before we have seen maybe more the word displacement. I think that's also terminology-wise something that we need to be a bit more careful in what we actually mean. There is relatively scarce literature on relocation or retreat. Retreat is actually not something that is used as a term so far in mountain regions. And we have been able, nevertheless, to distinguish three main types of and causes of relocation, which are related to water availability, so reducing water resources. That's the case in Mustang, Nepal, a village autonomously relocated. Then we have natural hazards. That's probably the most common one. There's plenty of examples also here from Europe, Austria, Switzerland, many other countries, but also in the developing world. And then infrastructure development, also very important. It's just this emblematic case of the church at Dresden, at the border. It's Italy, border region with Switzerland and Austria. But this is also very much, of course, in South Asia, in Asia. This is important in other ways that basically infrastructure development, such as hydropower plants, are forcing relocation. Now, one case we have worked for many years. This is in Peru. Indiana is really a wild place. It's actually quite close to Machu Picchu, only something like 20 kilometers downstream from Machu Picchu, the big Inca ruins, you know. And but fairly anybody knows this place. On the left side, you see how the village wasn't the whole structure before a very big debris flow event in 1998. That's really, I mean, the volume or the scale of these mass movements are absolutely extraordinary. And after that, there was a full destruction. Basically, the village has been wiped out, and then they relocated on the. I'll just show you that they relocated here on this sort of terrace, which you see now, that the modern town of Santa Teresa is located here. And what's interesting there, I mean, this is not only, but it's also climatic variability, but also linked to climate change impacts on high mountains, in glaciers, permafrost, which gets increasingly unstable and threatens this place. But these places have already before been under high pressure and risk from really big mass movement. And you see this here. This is, by the way, on the left hand is the road from the south to this village. One of the most scary roads I've been ever on, I have to say, in many mountain regions around the world. And what we have found in adaptation IRDR projects is really the risk perceptions between population and local governments and technical experts are so diverse, so that eventually it was really difficult to have a consensus approach to manage the risks. And people, I mean, there's a big economic pressure also here, or maybe incentive coming also in relation with Machu Picchu. So what we clearly see here, there's more interdisciplinary science and more transdisciplinary approaches needed. I would include here very much the co-production of knowledge. And this one this is just really for the discussion then as an input to say, okay, is it beyond limitation limits? Sorry, between adaptation limits. So how does retreat and relocation relate? And we have from Reinhard and colleague, we have these different risk spaces. Is it really tolerable, intolerable? Is this what we need to configure? In Santa Teresa, this case, where would it be located? And on the right side, this is a bit of a new concept we've developed together that sort of goes into existential dimensions of risks. And I think it will be interesting to see how these dimensions, which are between well-being, basic needs, and physical survival, how they relate to relocation. I think that is very much also context specific. And my final slide goes into that relocations in mountains, and I think this is also likely valid beyond mountains, that involves different driver perception, decision processes, and also different than migration. I think this is really, really important, that these are not necessarily the same processes. And then there is this discussion about relocations. They're always taking place in an environmental socio-political discourses of the time. So 50 years back, there was another discourse than we have today. And in the mountains, there are many mountain-specific discourses, like abandonment, the standing resisting nature's forces, self-conception, the national identity, which is, for instance, very important here in the Alps, but also really economic development. And then also these categories of planned, unplanned, managed, unmanaged, autonomous, and relocation category. I think it really depends also on socio-economic, political context, and eventually the relocation discussion decisions. I think this is maybe obvious, but just to emphasize, really go beyond simple, definitely monetary cost benefit considerations, and I think it all again calling for transdisciplinary approaches. So this is where so far I get, and the rest I will be very happy for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Christian. That was very interesting. Our next speaker is the session co-chair, Professor Reinhard Mechler from IIASA. He's the head of the group leader for systemic risk and resilience, and he'll be sharing some insights from Nepal. Go ahead, Reinhard.
Yeah, thanks, Sirkku. I wanted to move from Peru to Nepal, present a little bit on re-retreat. I know that's not the correct term, but wanted to present a re-retreat in river basins in Nepal, where communities were pushed out by the forces of nature and were like supported in coming back to where they dwelt beforehand. And that's work that Practical Action has been supporting, and Colin McQuiston will probably mention this later on. So on the time that we have, quickly here, it's Western Nepal. So this is a case of floodplains in the lowlands of Western Nepal and the Bardia and Kailali districts. What's the issue? Yeah, as to be expected, monsoon-related flooding affects settlements that have little flood protection in those reaches and all over Nepal, obviously. So also flooding leads to erosion of riverbanks, and rivers tend to shift course. So that's probably very important in that area. Rivers don't stay where they are, which is different from other places. Impacts and the risks actually of heavy flooding have displaced subsistence-based communities from floodplains. But it's not only flood risk that affects people, as this is actually from Colin there. He didn't know about this, but so there's a systems-based decision to be made. It's about flooding, it's about multi-hazards, but it's certainly about livelihood development and disaster preparedness. So it's also about development choices. So what are the choices and the issues that help to keep people where they would like to be and help them to climb the development ladder? Yeah, as a solution, our partners, and this is actually in the Flood Resilience Alliance, it's Practical Action and Mercy Corps, they have been operating and promoting the issue of biodikes. And this coupled with livelihood-centered development planning. So biodikes are made from natural material by the communities themselves. You plant bamboo or rattan on it, and you can use it actually for other issues. So it's a nature-based solution and also offers livelihood opportunities, as it can be combined with development-centered responses. So you can diversify agriculture, you see it here a bit behind the dike. You can plant sugarcane, groundnut as cash crops to create an income for those mostly subsistence-based communities. Biodikes are also great to modify river flows, to work with that changing river course, right? Like a fixed concrete-made or gabion-made wall doesn't do that. So that's very important in that context, and it helps to avoid sedimentation that then leads to further flooding. Of course, biodikes are not the panacea. They help with small to medium flooding, not high-level flooding. So there's no 100% protection in that setup, which implies living with nature and floods. So, but early warning, people-centered early warning can also help here. What we wanted to propose is also, so this experience you can also take into a decision-making framework, call it multi-resilience dividend decision-making, where it is about reducing the losses, the impacts, the risks, but it's also about second and third dividends, namely unlocking development potential and helping to create wider co-benefits. So for those communities that colleagues are working with, it's very important to climb that development ladder. And this triple dividend framework can help with doing that. Here, a quick example from a paper with Victor Röser of London School of Economics. Here you see a quick summary of what it is, these biodikes, and they're considered dividends in terms, so they can be considered in terms of reduced flood damage to agricultural land, but also increases in agricultural yields were reported, lower outmigration, also forced migration were reported. And there's also CO2 impacts and positive impacts on wildlife habitats. So that's a bit reporting the evidence needs reporting, and in that space of high-level risk and transformation, something that we are after with colleagues of practical action and other colleagues. Of course, the key question I would like to ask later on is transformation. Is this about positive or forced transformations, and is retreat part of this? And what actions to take at systems level? Maybe also tackling the root causes of risk, or is like intensifying the given processes, will that lead the way to think about to incur deep-rooted catalytic change? Last photo, I've been there, I've seen it a bit, only a few days, and that was thanks to practical action colleagues, was quite illuminating. And over to Sirkku and colleagues, thanks.
Thank you very much, Reinhard. Our final case will be presented by Tiziana Bonzon, who is the head of climate, migration and resilience of the International Federation of Red Cross and Crescent Societies. Tiziana, please.
Thank you so much, Sirkku, and greetings to all. Indeed, what I'd like to share with you is a little bit more of a practitioner's perspective based on the experience of our national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies around the world, but in particular from the Asia and Pacific region, where we've been most exposed, I have to say, to issues of disaster-related displacement and plant relocation. Just maybe linking to what we heard from a colleague from the IDMC, indeed disasters and the adverse effects of climate change are already leading to large-scale migration and displacement across the globe. We also know that disaster events or the threat of a disaster can indeed trigger displacement in many different ways. It's either through preemptive evacuations or planned relocations from high-risk hazard areas, or escape en masse from life-threatening sudden onset disasters, or also a gradual shift of populations away from areas of slow onset disaster, such as drought situations or due to the loss of livelihoods and increasing poverty. And we also heard, of course, that the climate change is only exacerbating the risk of disaster displacement. But displacement is also increasingly urban. I think this is important to highlight. Of the average of this approximately 17 million people at risk of being displaced by floods on an annual average, over 80% of these people are in urban and semi-urban areas. And displaced people who live in urban areas can become invisible. And this is due often to the assumptions that urban displaced people can count on the support of relatives or friends, or can have access to livelihoods in a much easier way. In 2019, the IFRC undertook a global review of the responses that national societies had to displacement in the context of a variety of settings, from the Indian Ocean tsunami to the Haiti earthquake. And one of the things that came out of this analysis is that one of the first steps towards effective prevention and preparedness involves actually an understanding of displacement as a risk that is triggered by disaster or climate change, but has the potential to be reduced or prevented. And subsequently, existing disaster risk reduction or climate change adaptation and vulnerability and capacity assessment tools and methodologies can be applied to consider the specific risk of disaster-induced displacement, and really include the human mobility dynamics and identify targeted mitigation and prevention measures. The negative consequences of displacement can therefore be minimized and managed through, for instance, an increased use of early warning systems, contingency planning, but also good policy and practice on evacuation and planned relocation. I'm going to say a few words about that. But maybe just to say that when planning, for instance, early warning and evacuations, vulnerabilities and protection risks must be considered so as to guarantee the safety of the people who are being evacuated. And for instance, failure to consider gender-sensitive approaches in early warning may in fact prompt or prolong displacement. And likewise, while planned relocation must be considered in some situations, great care must be taken to ensure that it safeguards the rights, the livelihoods, and the dignity of those affected. So when do we apply planned relocation? In a disaster context, a durable solution to disaster displacement can indeed be achieved through planned relocation. We have a number of examples, as I mentioned, in the Asia-Pacific region, mostly in post-disaster context. So for instance, after the Indian Ocean tsunami in Sri Lanka, in Indonesia, and in the Maldives, our national Red Cross societies were engaged in the construction of new housing for displaced communities. The Philippines Red Cross has supported planned relocation in the wake of a number of typhoons, including after Haiwan in 2013. And so did the Myanmar Red Cross in the wake of the 2015 floods and landslides. And most recently, both the Indonesian Red Cross and the Philippine Red Cross societies had to determine how to support planned relocation, which are usually determined by the national authorities, of course, but they engage in supporting the communities to find the best and appropriate ways for them to rebuild their lives. And this has been done, for instance, in the context of the imposition of a no-build zones post-earthquakes in central Sulawesi and Mindanao. A planned relocation is also a policy tool to reduce and manage disaster risk. National Red Cross societies, again in the Asia-Pacific region, have been supporting disaster risk reduction related relocation and resettlement projects in a number of contexts. I'm giving you an example from Living with Floods program, a program implemented by the Vietnam Red Cross, where they've been engaging in the construction of houses and pretty much building a whole new village, in fact, in the Cà Mau province, where they looked at housing, building a water supply system, an electricity system, and a kindergarten, and the infrastructure that is necessary to support, a whole community to start a new life again. The Samoa Red Cross has just recently supported a state-initiated and household-initiated disaster risk reduction plan relocation project to help communities living in coastal areas to move further inland. And this has been done through, for instance, the supply of rainwater harvesting systems. It's important to highlight that urban development is also something that needs to be considered and is driving planned relocation projects, unfortunately not always in a positive way. We know the compulsory land acquisitions, which result in the forced eviction and relocation of informal settlements from within city limits to make space for road and railway network improvements are unfortunately sometimes, common practices, and those negative considerations have to be taken into account. And finally, planned relocation can be seen as a measure to adapt to climate change, and this is already happening. If I can take another example from the Asia Pacific, this is already something that is taking place in Fiji, where after a number of, after decades of investing in measures to protect against the coastal erosion and flooding, planned relocation is pretty much a reality now for the governments. And of course, several coastal villages have and will have to relocate inland in the coming years. To conclude, I'd just like to share with you 4 main points. So the first is that understanding the causes of disaster displacement is not an easy thing, but it's crucial to be able to really see what are the underlying causes and what are the best responses to it. We know that in the context of disaster-induced displacement, where we need stronger investments in resilience, in DRR, in climate change adaptation, this can indeed contribute to community-based actions that can prevent the conditions that lead to displacement. But unfortunately, funding continues to be an issue to really look into these aspects. The other point is strengthening local capacities and incorporating, as I mentioned before, displacement risk in disaster risk management. When displacement is understood as a risk factor in disaster management, then the successful prevention efforts is linked to the resilience of the affected communities. And so preventing or mitigating displacement risks will depend on the capacities of local actors, and this necessitates investments in food security, livelihoods, health, shelter, DRR, and CCA. This also presents an opportunity to explore and scale up some new innovative ways of, for instance, scaling up early warning and anticipatory action, such as through the use of mechanisms now called forecast-based financing to better anticipate and reduce displacement risks ahead of impact. The third point is about addressing disaster displacement in local and national normative and policy frameworks. It's important that yeah, I'm just done, thanks. Civil society and international actors can indeed support interested states to adopt national and local policies and programs that address disaster-induced displacement and strengthen the resilience of affected people and host communities. We, of course, like to recommend that while some states may have adopted standalone laws and policies on displacement, it makes much more sense that prevention of displacement is not treated separately, but as part of general disaster risk management efforts. And finally, talking just a word on planned relocation. When it is done well, Planned relocation projects can be indeed an effective form of disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and may provide a durable solution for displaced communities. But we know that these projects are complex, they engage multiple groups, cultural issues, and planned relocations can be sometimes state and non-state led and can take lengthy periods of time to complete. And so they can actually end up in a very badly, can be actually done very poorly. And so when this is the case, we know that they can profoundly violate rights, especially human rights, and can undermine the dignity of the individuals affected. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tiziana. This final presentation of this case insight section of our session nicely wraps first the global view from Bina, and then the two cases from Christian and Reinhard, and then you brought the sort of practices globally and the view that you have through the International Red Cross and Crescent movement. We very much encourage questions through the Q&A function. Whilst we wait for those, we move on to the second section of the presentation. And here we really aim to bring you different types of disciplinary and interdisciplinary approaches that can help to understand manage retreat displacement. And our first speaker is Stefan Hochmeiner-Stiegler, who's from IIASA. He's a senior research fellow there, and you'll be talking about systemic risk and fiscal cost of displacement. Go ahead.
Thanks very much, Sirkku. I think the presentation of Tiziana, it very nicely actually also fits then with my discussion. She was talking about strong investment, funding issues, also about capacities, and also this kind of what we heard from the others, planned adaptation, multiple groups. I'm specifically now talking about the fiscal costs of displacement. Displacement is costly for all, including also a specific group which actually is also to deal with that. That's basically also on the country level. For example, finance ministries, they are also usually the ones which are actually having quite some, let's say, resources available to give some kind of funding to actually deal with part of these problems which are causing actually this kind of displacement. I'm just starting with one slide. Actually, Bina already was including referring to about actually first of all, displacement is not something which is happening equally across the world, and it's also not happening with the same magnitude to everybody because it's about capacities. If you can withstand some kind of flood events and you have some resources to cope with them, then probably you're not for a long time displaced, or you actually can try to reduce risk because of your resources you have. But actually some cannot, and actually what we really need to know is also what kind of capacities one has to deal with kind of displacement risk. And when I'm saying displacement risk from a, let's say, a quantitative risk management approach, it has to be somehow able to be quantified. So we need also to deal with that in a specific, let's say, from a modeling perspective. Somehow we have to quantify these kind of risks and relate this with costs. And one way forward with that is specifically with fiscal risk is that you actually think this within a liability framework. So governments, for example, if you want to have a specific approach with liabilities of disaster risk is with a so-called fiscal risk matrix. And it basically has a fiscal risk matrix thinks about explicit let's say liabilities, and that's usually state guarantees like reconstruction of public assets after disasters, for example. But there is also this kind of implicit or moral obligations. And when we think about internal or about displacement due to natural disaster events, they are definitely contingent, because displacement only occurs if an event is happening. So they are contingent, and they are happening because of some events which happen with a given probability. Now we are coming to the risk realm with a certain probability. So having this kind of risk matrix and thinking about displacement in as a form of a contingent moral obligation to deal with these losses, you can actually then also nicely relate this then also with, let's say, government responsibilities to deal with displacement. And one of the benefits of thinking in that way is that you actually can also think about ways forward how to quantify this risk. And we already heard from IDMC, they created their own kind of method to think about risk in terms of losses, to think about losses corresponding with probabilities. And we use this kind of data they provided to us with our so-called CAT-SIM. This is the catastrophe simulation model. So what you see here in this graph is basically, in a nutshell, what this model is doing. It calculates the capacity of a government to finance losses or finance costs. And as you can imagine, the government is quite powerful. It can use quite a different kind of resources. It can divert the budget to use part of these, let's say, fundings for dealing with losses or dealing with costs of displacement. They can also think about taxation, taking credits, international borrowing, or international assistance. All of these kind of different options could be in principle available, but are not available for all. So it really is a different kind of animal if you're looking at the US or looking at Afghanistan or looking at very poor countries. But if you're thinking what we have here in this, let's say, figure as step one, somehow measuring these capacities, and for us, for the government, for example, it could be the financial resilience, how much money they have available to divert to finance costs or losses, and you combine this with in step two, it's called this annual loss distribution, but it basically means that you have for each of a probability that displacement occurs, you have also a corresponding cost. Then when you bring in the costs and the, let's say, ability to finance them together, then this is something which we have called a fiscal gap. It's a kind of a risk metric. It gives you the probability that some of the costs of displacement you cannot actually borne by yourself anymore. And that's something which we're calling a fiscal resource gap event. And as you can imagine, there could be different options here. First of all, the costs of the displacement could be very low. And when they are very low, even in cases when you don't have a lot of resources, also your risk is very low. But they could be also, the cost could be very high. And also your, let's say, resources are high. You still actually, in terms of risk, are also quite safe, because even if the losses are very high, you could deal with them, at least now from the fiscal side. But there are very often situations where, well, the risk is quite high, but actually financial resilience is quite low. And what we did actually was combining this, and we have seen this already with Bina's graph. We basically, this kind of risk metric gives us a kind of overview which countries actually are very much exposed to this kind of risks of displacement and having not the ability to finance it, at least on the country level. And when you're doing that, what you basically have is now a quantitative measure of risk for displacement, which you can actually include in kind of budget planning processes. It really bringing the costs into the national planning budget sheet. And when you're doing that, then they are not hidden anymore. And when they are not hidden anymore, you actually can use it also to argue for more funding, also for planned adaptation, also for possible, let's say, managed retreat if the cost is too high. If there are other options available, at least it gives us let's say, a way forward, maybe in an iterative manner, to think about how you want to deal with these costs in the future. So and I'm probably that's my major conclusion here with this presentation. If you bring in this kind of fiscal risks due to displacement into the national planning, also the kind of coordination and cooperation between ministries could be enhanced, just because you have it now in the budget sheet. And if you have to deal with this costs by, just think about the version from the budget, there are trade-offs, there are opportunity costs. So actually bringing this into the budget planning sheet, where also hopefully also increase this kind of cooperation, and also one can think more clearly about, at least from one perspective, from the fiscal risk perspective, about sustainability and resilience development planning processes. And these kind of processes are very much now well developed within natural disaster frameworks. I think they are also quite fit nicely within this kind of displacement risk frameworks, and could be a way forward. What Reinhard also mentioned, this kind of, let's say, fiscal risk analysis methods could be also related with systemic risk and transformation approaches. And I think I would leave it here with that, and that would be the end of my presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Unfortunately, our next speaker is unable to join us today, but she has sent her presentation as a video. So Reinhard, if you please share it. But our next speaker is Dr. Sonia Saminsky from the London School of Economics, where she's the head of adaptation research at the Grantham Institute. And she will be speaking to us via the video once we get it up and running. And again, I do urge you to send us questions through the conference function, if you have them.
Hello, many thanks for inviting me to this panel. I'm Sonia Saminsky, and it's great to know that there are so many colleagues and friends also on this panel. But I really have to apologize that I can't join in person because unfortunately there has been a date clash. But I hope that some of the points that I will raise now will help with the discussion and also leave you with some food for thought. What I will do is I will share a few insights from our work on coastal change and, well, as we call it, planned relocation. That the work focuses on questions around funding mechanisms. So I'll leave you with a few insights on that.
Okay, next one.
And some of the starting points here that I will make are covered in some recent work that we've done with Jonathan Boston from Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand, and Akitesh Panda, who used to work with me here at the LSE and is now at the MCII initiative. And we're sort of bringing together different perspectives. Jonathan has obviously a lot of insights in what's going on in New Zealand, and also did some work looking at various schemes around the world where coastal change and managed retreat are actively discussed and practiced. And Akitesh has done some case study work in India, and I will tell you a little bit more about my work here in England. But so we looked at experiences with funding planned relocation, also in terms of where the funding comes from and how it is allocated. And what we recognize is that obviously planned relocation is a very complex and challenging tool, but for some areas inevitable, and some unfortunately with climate change heading to where, you know, with regards to global warming degrees, you know, it is most likely that this will become a necessity for other areas around the world. So one of our observations was that, you know, what's really important is to revisit the principles that could help inform funding mechanisms. And I just want to highlight some of these. So, you know, obviously, you know, planned relocation or, you know, managed retreat, or however you want to call it, is a hugely difficult topic, and you know, touches on many really challenging questions. You know, fairness, getting this actually, you know, arranged in a way that it respects community needs, and that it is also owned by basically the community, and that there is sort of a fair and transparent decision-making process attached to it. And, you know, for a lot of people, this is often seen as the last resort, and let's try out every other options. And I think that's probably an interesting perspective that we might want to revisit, whether, you know, there is also, you know, recognizing all its challenges, but also an opportunity through planned relocation, and that this could also be woven into a more sort of positive resilience strategy and transformation. But yeah, what we said here is, you know, just mapping out some of the guiding principles, and which I think should be reflected whenever we're trying to create a framework, create some financial instruments that can help to address this. And, you know, principle of minimizing long-term societal cost in its broadest sense, not just financial, but looking at the various costs that arise for society, and then having this lens of intergenerational and intragenerational equity is really important, and hugely difficult to actually resolve. But what is it that you want to do, and how can you do it in a way that you actually do not disrupt lives and livelihoods, and also create opportunities arising from that for those people who need to relocate. And then I think an important point is this idea of integrating funding, planned relocation with national development plans and adaptation strategies. And it needs to be transparent and accountable, particularly with regards to the allocation of the funds. So these are some of the guiding principles, which I think, this is not sort of rocket science. They are fairly, well understood, but it's useful to keep those in mind when now thinking about designing funding instruments. And when I say thinking about funding instruments, I mean, our work has been sort of revisiting what exists, what is out there already. I think it won't come as a big surprise that funding mechanisms exist often in the context of sudden extreme events, and then in the aftermath, maybe relocating people. What really doesn't exist, or is really just starting to emerge, are these solutions for slow onset events. And there are some examples here where we also see potentially emerging new approaches. And yeah, I don't want to go into detail because I also would like to just close by reflecting and sharing some insights from work that we're doing as part of the Flood Resilience Alliance. And many of the organizations represented here on this panel today are engaged in this alliance. And the focus has been on assessing resilience and giving communities the tools to monitor. Has led to a new initiative on resilience pathway in the face of climate change, given that the city is located on the coast. And as a result of this, and supported by work, or led by work by Marsh, the insurance broker, the local community is currently engaged in trying to identify different financial options that might help in planning for coastal change and erosion, and also the need to relocate parts of the population. So this work is in progress, and I'm just flagging here some of the options that have been reviewed in terms of practicalities and suitability. But I think it's an interesting example of where actually the community or a local authority kind of sees the need for it early on. It's not trying to find sort of financially acceptable but also fair solutions. And yeah, unfortunately, given where we're heading with change, this is likely to affect more areas. And again, apologies for not being around for the discussion. I'm sure my colleagues will have plenty to say. And in case of questions, here's my email. Thanks again, Reinhard.
Thank you, Svenja, and apologies for some of the poor quality there. Unfortunately, we were unable to fix it. But our final speaker, moving away from the financial aspects of managed retreats or planned relocation, as some of our panelists call it, we move on to Elisa Cagliari, who is a research fellow at UCL in London. And you will be talking more about the policy and governance aspects of this issue. Go ahead, Elisa.
Yes, thank you very much, Sirkku, for the introduction. And it's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to close these two very interesting rounds of presentation by sharing some reflections that I have as a political scientist in the spirit of the interdisciplinarity of this session, and reflect a bit about what it means to carry out resettlement or relocation efforts in the context of climate change, not just as a reactive or an ad hoc measure, but rather as an anticipatory and strategic form of adaptation. And this also implies thinking about the scale at which these efforts will need to take place, and therefore thinking that this will need the coordination and the leadership by the state, essentially. So the question I would like to pose to you all is, what kind of public policies and mechanisms do we need to put in place for planned relocation to become a strategic and managed form of adaptation, and how do these public policies look like? And I think to respond to this question, is important to consider two different dimensions. So first of all, we need to understand how these efforts are different from more traditional, let's say, adaptation. Here we have said a couple of times that probably planned relocation is an extreme form of adaptation, maybe transformational, but what does transformational mean in practice when we talk about, governance structure or institution and so on? And this is the first dimension. And the second one, I think that it's important to consider is that how is a planned relocation induced by climate change different from experience we had in the past? For example, when relocation was motivated by development objectives. And Christian showed you a picture actually of my region, where we had experience of community relocation because of energy development. So what can we learn from these experiences? And is climate change as a driver really making these new experiences of planned relocation different? So these are a very compelling question, I think. Unfortunately, I don't have many answers to share with you today. And this is mainly because research has not really focused that much on these dimensions. And if you look at the literature which is out there, it mostly focuses on what planned relocation means for community. And we know that, for example, it can lead to impoverishment, it can be very costly in financial terms, but also, and more importantly, in the human dimension. So we know pretty much a lot of what planned relocation means for communities, but the same is not true when we want to understand what it means for government. So I think that probably one of the key messages from my short intervention would be that we need to kind of change this perspective and try to understand a bit more what are also the innovations in governance and institutions that we need in order to support these processes. And again, this is, a consequence, this lack of research is a consequence, as I said, of the fact that the most of experiences are ad hoc, are reactive, are mostly initiated by the same communities. Sometimes are also supported by, local authorities. I'm not saying that, the state is completely absent, but this tends to happen in the void of supportive policy frameworks. And as climate change intensifies, government will need to shift from supporting these one-time emergency solutions to devise some strategic approaches to protect the citizen. And this is basically what state-led planned relocation is about. And there is only one country in the world that has started to think about these issues, and it was already mentioned by Tiziana, and it's Fiji. Fiji is the only country in the world that has elevated planned relocation as a national priority. It has produced some planned relocation guidelines in 2018. Now it's in the process of releasing the standard operating procedure to operationalize these guidelines. If you look at the climate change bill, which is currently under public consultation, there's a full section on planned relocation, and the plan is to establish a dedicated task force. But also, there's already another bill in force which established a fund for these relocation efforts to be financed. And it's actually seeking for contributions from different countries, like, for example, developed countries, indeed. And I think New Zealand has already provided some resources in this respect. So what we're trying to do at UCL within our project that we have actually focusing on loss and damage is to try to look into and better understand this process of policy formation around planned relocation in Fiji, and try to understand what are the specific governance innovations that that state is putting in place and that are needed, for example, in other contexts. And unfortunately, we're starting the data collection next week, so I don't have results to share with you, but yet. But just to give you an idea of the challenges that I think we're gonna encounter in terms of governance, I can imagine that, for example, a specific challenge would be the temporal and the geographical scale at which these these planned relocation projects take place, or the way, for example, uncertainty is dealt with in the process, especially about climate risk, when you have to inform decisions that are permanent and probably, well, potentially very high regret in a way. So how do we work with this uncertainty at the government level? And also how we coordinate all the different actors which are involved in these efforts. And I'm not just talking about domestic actors, but in a context like Fiji, international actors do play a really important role, for example, donors. And so what's the influence of these different actors, and how can we bring them together, maybe in new and innovative partnerships? So these are some of the challenges that I think we will find, and I actually would be very curious to hear from you if you have other dimensions that you think we could focus on. And basically the idea with this case study, which is really a unique case, and the word is like a revelatory case study, is to extract some lessons that can be useful also for other countries that we need to implement planned relocation in a strategic way, as a way to protect their citizens. And mindful of time, I would like to close this brief talk by saying that, of course, much of the discussion around planned relocation, and I think also the case studies we discussed today highlight this, is taking place in the global south. I think that there's a huge need to raise the profile of this conversation in the north too. Probably not really in the US, because there's a kind of a more lively discussion about, for example, managed retreat. But if I think about Europe, which is the region where I come from, this is not really the case. And we have many examples of communities being already moved because of climate risk, and especially I think about flood risk. And we have example in Austria, in Germany. We are starting even conversation in Italy in this respect. So yeah, I would like to close with this call for more research, even in the global north, on the governance side of the story related to planned relocation, and with the hope that our contribution can really support government in get these very complex processes right. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Elisa. We have now come to the end of our presentation parts of the session, and we have a question from the audience from Alex, who says, "All right, planned relocation is a complex process. To my knowledge, China is one of the few countries that has official training institutions. And the question is, what are the needs for financing resettlement training programs given the complexity of the task?" Is there anybody here who would like to answer that question? Needs for financing and training. Many of you have touched on this issue, but is there somebody who would like to answer?
Seems a bit difficult there, given I'm not aware of what this training program entails. Is it government officials? Is it stakeholders? Is it those affected, right? I mean, China indeed has also like quite a history of relocation. So I think, so I don't know, this is a tough one, but maybe Elisa seems to be nodding. So maybe she, no. Okay.
I was nodding that it's a tough one.
Yes, we will. Thank you, Alex. We will leave the question there. Hopefully we'll come back to it. We now have a short commentary before we start discussing these issues more. We'll have a short commentary from Colin McQuistion, who's the head of climate and resilience at Practical Action. You have just heard all these presentations, Colin. What are your thoughts at this moment?
Thank you very much, Sirkku, and thank you very much for an excellent set of presentations. So I'm Head of Climate Resilience and Practical Action, and I will be talking, as Tiziana did, from the practitioner's perspective. I think first of all, we had a really good set of presentations. I particularly appreciated Bina setting us off and setting the scale of the problem. This is clearly a global issue with massive consequences, particularly in the poorest countries. Christian highlighting that example from Peru, a country where we work, it's that sudden and catastrophic change in the landscape. Clearly, those communities probably had very little, if any, time at all to plan to respond to that event, but they seem to have shifted and relocated to that high level land, and obviously something is keeping them there, because given the threat, the risk in which they are living, that is just a phenomenal example. Reinhard, with the example from Nepal, this dynamic riverine landscape, an area which I know quite well. Yes, resilience can be built, particularly if we think coherently around the resilience dividend. The multiple benefits, not just the mitigation of the natural risk, but the multiple benefits that some of these mitigation actions can deliver, and then to start thinking about transformational approaches. Tiziana highlighted for me one thing that is so often overlooked, and that is the urban dimension of planned relocation, migration, displacement. We're seeing shifts from rural to urban areas, but we're also seeing shifts within urban areas themselves. And I particularly appreciate the ideas around the use of forecast-based action to really drive, particularly in the area of slow onset events. Drought is going to be getting worse, water supplies are going to be getting worse. We know these things are going to be happening. We need to start planning and thinking about them now. Stefan highlighted that movement is related to capacities, the capacity to be able to move. And that really highlights that we need to start thinking about the financial resources that can help to support displacement, migration, planned relocation, and start thinking about unpacking those hidden costs. Sven, you highlighted, we need to think where the money's coming from, and also highlighted something that I was going to pull out, which was really the displacement migration doesn't need to be seen to be purely a problem. It can also be an opportunity. It is an opportunity for a sort of a positive resilience strategy, moving people away from areas which are perhaps becoming no longer tenable, but also looking at them as capitals to support economic development. And then finally, Elisa highlighting the fact that the scale of displacement is going to require coordination, it's going to require leadership, and therefore governance will be critical. So just based on my own practical experience with practical action, I think the thing that we always need to be very clear on when we talk to communities on the front lines of climate change is that movement has been a historic adaptation mechanism for generations. It's not something new, it's something that's always happened, and I think we need to get that into the discourse. The other thing that we've realized from our programs is that these displacements, these migrations, operate at various scales, and they also operate on different time scales. And certainly in our program work in South Asia, we see a lot of seasonal migration. There's also temporary migration where people will move away from an area for a certain amount of time, but then with the longer term aim to go back to where they came from. But then of course, I think with a lot of the examples that were shown by my colleagues, a lot of this is permanent. People move, no longer tenable where they came from. I think for myself, the critical piece of the puzzle is context. And I think relocation done for people is a mistake. It needs to be done by them and with them. And I think there are many examples, particularly 2 decades ago, where people were relocated, and they were relocated based on the perceptions of the relocator. This is a much better site. This has got better opportunities. This has got a lovely house. You've got a unit of land. You've got these things. But actually, what was keeping that person in their original site were different values. And I think context is key, and we really need to bring the relocated into the debate and into the discussions. And then my final point, and this is something that colleagues in Bangladesh, particularly Salim ul-Haq and ICAD, are looking at is looking at the coastal zone migration in this case, but looking at it as an opportunity, moving people as a productive capital. These people can engage in economic activity. They can be drivers of secondary city development, really very much as an alternative to what is currently happening in Bangladesh, where people are just moving to Dhaka, the capital city, and the essential services that city is trying to maintain are getting to breaking point. Look at this as an opportunity to develop regional centres in which can attract people driven by economic, social, and other drivers. So those are my thoughts. Thank you very much for this opportunity to input.
Thank you very much. We now have Reinhard will share some guiding questions for our discussion. Reinhard, do you want to kick us off in that direction?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the presentation. So let me just go to the guiding questions. Thanks for the great presentations. Yeah, maybe I do it like this. Put up like this. Yeah, some guiding questions for our discussion for the presenters, but also to the audience. Why don't we go into the first one? So, how robust and comprehensive is the existing and emerging evidence? Or to turn it around, what is missing from best practice or knowledge in other domains? Any comments on that? Maybe it can be coupled with a second point on what's really new and or transformational about retreat. We heard a bit, things are old and well understood. We also heard there's innovation here. So I think it would be great to tackle those two questions and see about comments. Let's maybe start with us here and then see about comments we're getting also in. Anybody willing to or interested in making a point?
I can maybe come in and just link it to the reflections from Colin just now, because I think both you and also Elisa made some really pertinent points that are linked here, and in terms of what's different, what's new. We talked about the scale and the impacts, but then you also say that we need to also look at the opportunity here. And I think from our perspective, working on internal displacement and looking at through the forced movement lens, I think that's where there's still a huge gap in our understanding, and also in the language you use. You rightly, also someone mentioned we need to be careful, how I think Christian said, what we call it. And it's indeed something that I think, again, we have to do much more closely with researchers and practitioners in country and communities, but also within governments, and to really define define in a sense common standards, because the huge data gaps that I talked about and that are really there, even on the basics. Like I said, we have numbers on movements, but we know very little in the context of sudden onset events, for example. We know very little what happens to people after the event, even already a few days later or weeks later, years later in particular. But that's also due to the fact of this assumption that they, as was said earlier, they are taken up and supported by families in urban settings, or that they just go back and reconstruct and rebuild and or somehow locally integrate. And that's where the opportunity is lost that you've been talking about, Colin, I think. And it's been great to see that there was in this conference some really strong reviews done of practices of relocation and success. I think there was a keynote yesterday, or was it even earlier today? I think yesterday, on a full global review of relocation programs, and looking at this through the justice lens. There's been similar types of reviews done but I think we need more of those that dig deeper into what Elisa was talking about, and really understanding the processes and what did it really take to do this successfully, and then come back to learning from that, also to fill these kind of basic data gaps. And I say that because currently the way that data is collected, we can't put together very often the different data sets because of this very different understanding of what it means, how communities move, how people plan for that, which government entities need to be included or not, etc. So I do think that science and research can really contribute to that. hugely by offering support to the documentation of this, but not necessarily by defining, as I think was also mentioned earlier, all the questions anymore and the hypotheses, but allowing for those to emerge, from within the different settings, and us to support with the right tools to document. Thanks. Thanks,
Bina. Anybody else on that point?
Maybe just briefly on what we know or what. So I think I have the impression we have quite a lot of experiences what did not work, what is not appropriate, and this I just also referring back to what Colin mentioned. So many examples, and I could just another one in Colombia. I was working for quite a while on flood and lahar early warning systems, and in the most flood hazard prone areas, there actually relocated people from civil war in Colombia were relocated. So I mean, we know this is totally inappropriate. We have so many examples which is inappropriate, and we also know that we cannot just do it with a disciplinary or technical approach. We also know that it's highly context specific. It depends on the fiscal, on the financial system, on the governance, which is part of it, on the social system, also on the context. There have been examples, for instance, in 50 years back and more, 70 years in the Alps, when decisions were made whether mountain communities were maintained or given up because of snow avalanche hazards. There's cases in Switzerland, I think also in Austria, but this was in a national discourse about should we basically defend our populations, mountain populations, against nature. So I mean, we need to see this is so context specific, and I think what we actually do not know is really what works. We can only say that it's highly context specific, and there's maybe some very broad general categories, but I think we're really missing experiences and evidence from what works.
Great, thanks, Christian. Anybody else on this novelty, innovation, and so on?
Maybe I can jump in, Reinhard.
Please.
No, just building on what Bina and Christian said, indeed, we do need more evidence and research, I would say, and based on practice, really based on real experiences of the communities themselves. And just going back first of all to the terminology, and as we're seeing this during this session, that we're using different terms almost interchangeably, but we also know that they can't be used like that all the time, and that they refer to specific situations, to specific dimensions of either human mobility, whether it's voluntary forced induced by an event, or it's a measure that is mainly looking at people or mainly looking at infrastructure. So we can approach these things from so many different angles, and so yes, I would say the more research will be needed. But there was a study which I got also inspiration from when I was preparing for this session, and this is something conducted by the Platform for Disaster Displacement called Living Place and Restoring Home, that has looked at over 300 cases of planned relocation. And it's really interesting that, to see that exactly as we heard, that they are very context specific, but they span from being, proactive projects to being reactive. So you have all sorts of sort of projects that respond to different needs and different types of situations. Maybe just a final comment from me would be to really, I think the first condition or the first question that should be asked is really, is this necessary? Is this, have we tried everything else? Exactly, because it's so complex. And then to make it intensively participatory, whenever, and is this transformational? What would be, what do we mean by transformational? I think transformational in this conversation means that we're not just trying to cope, and we're not just trying to increment, have an incremental approach, but we're really trying to adopt something that goes beyond those two steps, if I can say so. This is not about just coping, so just trying to do a little bit more than, or doing a little bit more than what we've been doing, but it's really about adopting something completely different, and this is why it's so complex. And this is why we need so much more analysis to really do it right well, because we heard that in fact we have far too many examples where it goes wrong.
Great, thanks, Tiziana. I would also have a quick comment to make on these two first bullets. So like what do we know or not know, and like what's new and what's transformational. And I think indeed what Colin referred to, the context matters a lot. So look into context, then we see indeed relocation, forced or planned, has been quite old. Also, Elisa went into that. But I think what's a bit new is the urgency and the scale. And I wanted to bounce that back, this question in a second, maybe to Tiziana and Bina again. So the urgency from climate change, and then also that scale that's perceived to be large and massive. Numbers are being put together, right? And that's, of course, behind the science paper that Bina led. But I would come back in a second to that question. Is this scale and urgency issue really, what do we know about that one? So it's old, but it's also new. What I heard a lot is there's quite some innovation, right? We heard a lot. I was quite stunned by Svenja's video presentation. So the finance sector has really developed, has really detected it. This finance instrument that can help with relocation in the UK. So that's not surprising. The finance sector is always quite agile, up to speed. Insurance is also not lagging very much behind. I think they're also picking it up. We heard from colleagues, government innovation is not so much there, right? Elisa was quite clear, and Tiziana, Fiji is only experimenting. I think here much more is needed. But Colin and colleagues, NGOs, are working a lot on social and economic innovation. So the case I presented, so that also seemed to indicate it's old and new, right? Communities are being forced out, they come back if they're supported. You can innovate things, but also these techniques have been around quite a bit. Nature-based solutions are not fully novel in itself, but the scale of it and doing it. And maybe the integration is new. Maybe that's another context argument. So nature-based solutions by themselves don't lead to the solution for those communities, but if you integrate those with cash crop planting, cash crops and stuff, this may be quite interesting. What I've seen in Nepal, people are producing like chairs and tables out of rattan and bamboo, and that seems to be selling well in Europe and other places. So maybe there's a slight innovation that just needs to be engineered and implemented. Before maybe handing over about this urgency thing, I would really like maybe to check in on that. What was also new to me is this urban space. So the context, the urban space, it was quite surprising to hear that from Tiziana. Also, there's relocation also in the urban space of people and so on. But that's probably also a little bit more novel, right? That there's this idea that we need to move whole cities and think about doing that. And certainly some cities in Indonesia, maybe not to talk about Jakarta, but some other million cities are holding 1 million people or so, also considering that concretely. So I keep rambling on, but this urgency, can we touch base on that urgency again, and maybe link that also to that question, the next one, this physical and social trigger. The whole conference was really like this, the first word in the conference in the plenary talked about urgency. So what's this trigger? Like what is exciting, or what what is driving us? And any comment from maybe from Bina or Tiziana would be interesting, and just to bring in. I mean, you made it, but a question is also, can we put down some more concrete decision support that could identify that, or is it more like a feeling and the evidence coming in? So yeah, would still be interested to hear from Bina and Tiziana, maybe also Stefan, because Stefan talked about that, of course, also. Can finance be the trigger? So sorry, we touched on it, but it would be nice to maybe have a quick check-in if there's any comments to be made by colleagues. Else we can also move to the next question. Thanks.
Yeah, just a comment, Reinhard. I think what's important is actually that that there is a raising awareness in these different kind of sectors, and specifically for governments. Usually a lot of money is lying there, and so making the success is really also bringing this somehow more into the development resilience agenda. So yeah, so that's probably one of the I would say important steps.
Maybe I can just
Thanks,
briefly add
yeah.
to that. I completely agree. And I think that's really where we also see a huge gap in the policy space is government ownership. You mentioned that there's less innovation, but the problem is also in a sense that, when we look at the risk advances made in risk assessments, it's been indeed also driven a lot by industries like the insurance industry or finance, but it's been also done in black boxes. And it's only really relatively recently that this has been opened up for catastrophic risk insurance, pools, etc., at the national or regional level, but also at the community level. But often these tools are also very, very complex to manage, to follow, and often maybe we don't need also always the most sophisticated tools at every level. And it's really about adapting those to what's good enough to have and actually feasible also with limited capacities in country. And I think therefore, this links really to the what works question, is that we are often also quick in documenting, those approaches that give us quick results and numbers. The tendency to put out clear numbers is also there because that's what policymakers also like to put their hands on and then take and use for their own internal advocacy to make the case for more investment, etc. But the complexity and the nuances that we're dealing with here about when you're talking about social tipping points, there are new approaches. At IIASA, your colleagues are working on agent-based modeling, system dynamics. But there again, these approaches are complex, but also they need ultimately then for decision-making to become decision-making tools, data to be fed in, and that's where we again have a huge stumbling block.
Thank you very much, Dina. I wanted to move, as we're slowly running out of time. I wanted to move to the final question. I was very, very sort of excited, but also saddened to hear Elisa's presentation in terms of how much is sort of national policy focused on this, and what are the sort of government and governance frameworks for this, and to hear that there aren't that many. And I was wondering, simultaneously, we've heard in this panel from Practical Action and from the Red Cross and Crescent societies that much action is already going on, irrespective of this kind of government sort of support and so on. And I was wondering, sort of, how can we improve the situation? What are these roles for national policy and NGOs working together, etc.? Where do you see the biggest sort of questions emerging there, and things that need to be addressed?
Well, this is Elisa. Maybe I can start reflecting a bit on this last question. And actually, yes, as I was saying in my presentation, there are not many countries thinking about planned relocation as a national priority. But I think that, for example, international spaces like climate negotiations, like the UNFCCC, can actually play an important role in raising awareness at the country level on this being kind of a priority for many vulnerable states. And I'm thinking, for example, at institutions within the UNFCCC, like the Warsaw International Mechanism. We know that there's a task force on displacement there, which, and many of you are very familiar with this, mechanism, this is specific institution. And it's called Task Force on Displacement, but at the end of the day, it talks about the full spectrum of human mobility. So from international migration to displacement to the issue of planned relocation. And this can be a useful tool for government to familiarize with the issue, to exchange best practices and learn somehow from each other. And actually this issue of knowledge generation within the women, within Task Force on Displacement has been one of the main dimensions to be pursued. This, maybe, yeah, it would have been nice to see even more action on the ground in this respect, but at least the knowledge component of the story is pretty dominant. So I see a role for more cooperation at this international level. Actually, the regional level also plays a role. For example, in the Pacific, there's a lot of discussion on forms of human mobility and planned relocation within regional cooperation institutions, and not just at that level. I think also at the role of donors and the role they can play in that, with for example, the GIZ, they have big projects on human mobility in the area, and I think they played a really important role in raising the profile, for example, of addressing relocation and resettlement in that sphere. Of course, these actors have their own agendas. So on the one hand side, of course, they can help raising the profile, but on the other side, they also pursue their own interest in breakage. So for example, one insight that I can share from Fiji is that in that context, then relocation is framed as a form of extreme adaptation or last resort adaptation, while, for example, at the international level is framed more as loss and damage. And here we can ask ourselves how much the fact that these kind of programs are, financed by, developed countries like the EU, etc., influence the way also that these issues are framed at the local level. And yeah, I could talk forever about this. So probably I leave the space maybe to my colleagues that they provide more insights on the NGOs and practice dimension of the story.
Sure. Colin, maybe you want to share some insights here from the practitioner perspective on the last question that we have there.
Right, thank you, Sirkku. And it's great to follow on from Elisa, because I was going to talk about the water. It's the global mechanism that is there to support impacts of climate change, and for many people, relocation, migration, displacement is a consequence of climate impacts. I think for me, the key is relocation. It's not one size fits all, and I think we need diversity. We need multiple actors. That relocation is about moving people's lives, their livelihoods, their cultures, everything. It needs to be comprehensive, and therefore we need that representation. It's not just governments, it's not just ministries, it needs to be inclusive. And I think the challenge is that we need to think about what is being lost in that process. People can move or can be moved, but not everything can move. And those people are going to lose connections to the landscape in which they grew up, or the heritage, the culture, and also the biodiversity. And I think we need to remember that they need to move to somewhere much better. It's not just better, it needs to be much better to compensate them for the things that they will have lost. And that brings me nicely back into the Water International Mechanism, the loss and damage discussions at the global level, and the implications that has for national governments. We've just done a couple of studies in Nepal and Bangladesh, looking at what the existing national context around loss and damage, what the governments are thinking about, what structures are in place, how do they assess irreversible climate impacts, and what can they do about it, and how can they finance it. And in both countries, there may be some bare bones for a policy position in place, but the content is lacking. Effective relocation planning is totally absent. There's very little to build on at the national level, and I think we do need to be thinking about building the capacity at that level, because they are going to be ultimately the agencies that are charged and responsible for, at least for the first line, in regards to plan relocation. And what we found in both Nepal and Bangladesh is there is a complete lack of capacity at that level. So there's a massive effort needed. And the pace at which it's happening, as Reinhard said, it's so fast that we're playing catch up to a huge degree. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. And I will now hand over to Reinhard to make a final question and also close the session.
I had a few more questions or comments. Hope to pick those up later, but maybe a quick observation is only on the governance innovation, right? We agreed that on the governance innovation side, more is to be done. Fiji is there, China is doing something. It's certainly human mobility is high on government's agendas, but this relocation retreat seems not so high on the agenda. So it's quite interesting, quite surprising that the loss and damage debate, which is quite vague, very broad and everything, seems to push the debate quite a bit, right? We got this expert group on displacement. I think IIASA is part of this. And then also there's a global platform for displacements, and some countries seem to be quite willing. So it looks like the international debate may lead to further action nationally. It may come from that whole loss and damage, existential risk setup. But that's maybe more like an hypothesis or like something to think about later. But I thought here we got lots of things happening locally and then internationally, but maybe at national levels more is needed. And let's see where this is going. If you can keep this as maybe as an observation, I'm happy to, yeah, maybe close this session because probably we are running out of time. But let me thank presenters a lot for like the great insight. And there was a great further continuation of discussions we've had and others have had. So I think there's much more to discuss over the next month and years, and also maybe in 2 years' time if there's another one of these retreat conferences. So thanks all for the time and the efforts made. Also to Svenja coming in via video. And with that, let me close this session. And yeah, thanks all and have a good day, good night, and bye-bye.
Thank you, Reinhard.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.